is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and today we're going to cut to the chase because we have a killer guest on the podcast, Jim Zub, the man behind the Dungeons & Dragons Young Adventurers Guides, called in for a can't-miss interview. Now, you may be familiar with Jim's work. He writes literally everything, from creator-owned work like Skull Kickers and Wayward, to Dungeons & Dragons, The Legends of Baldur's Gate, as well as D&D Rick and Morty, and work for Marvel and DC Comics. You've definitely seen his name on the shelves of your local shop. So without further ado, the hardest working man in storytelling, Jim Zub. Hey Jim, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
We are fantastic. We are super stoked to have you on the show tonight.
Oh, thanks.
For our listeners at home, we recently stumbled across Dungeons & Dragons Young Adventurers Guides, and I think that this is the book that's probably had me, and I think I could definitely speak for you with this, Stu, had us the most excited of any D&D book that's come out in easily the last 5 years.
Oh, easily.
Whoa.
And they didn't really stumble. We didn't stumble across them. They sent them to us because they're really nice.
I tripped walking into your house, Stu.
Fair enough.
Stumbled in my own way.
But no, yeah, Hambo's exactly right. Like, I think that the Young Adventurers Guides are just so perfect in every way. They're just something that I've always wanted out of D&D, and I have my like little issues with 5th edition, and like
I don't say.
Yeah, I know. And I just think that they're fantastic. I think they're the perfect entryway.
Thank you so much. You're so nervous when we're putting these together, and you feel like you've got a plan and you know what you want it to be. And then, the creative process is always filled with ups and downs. You don't know how it's all going to turn out. And then even if you do it the way you want, is the audience going to respond to it? Are people going to see what you saw in it? And the response from the D&D community and the role-playing community at large and the people at Wizards of the Coast and everyone has been phenomenal. I really braced my co-writers for potential disaster. I was like, it's not a crunchy book, and there's a segment of fandom that's going to be like, where are the rules and why is there no dice systems? So I was braced for not the worst case scenario. I still knew where we were heading with it, but I was like, this is for brand new players. This is for kids. This is for a very specific audience. And those aren't necessarily the people that are going to be contacting us on Twitter or reaching out right off the bat. And so I kind of braced here we go. I hope people like them. And was pleasantly, honestly, just blown away by how positive everyone's been about the line, how excited they are about the new artwork and our particular approach to introducing role-playing precepts to people. So
it's amazing because I actually have one of my oldest and dearest friends. He hit me up once because he's like, I think you're the guy to ask about this, Hambone. My son wants to get into Dungeons & Dragons. What do I do? And he had just ordered the starter set for 5th edition. And then he's like, I don't know what else. Do I get the player's handbook? And I said, first things first, go out and get the Young Adventurers Guides. This is exactly who the book's written for. His son is probably 10, 11 years old at this point. And he did, and he said his kid was over the moon for it.
Awesome.
I will tell you, I was in Barnes & Nobles recently. I was buying little books for my goddaughter. She's still on the block books. Mm-hmm. And in the same child section on the other side were the Young Adventurers Guides right there on an end cap, which I thought was the coolest thing because it's right in the place where I think it needs to be. It's not quite on the D&D fantasy shelf over in science fiction and fantasy. It's right there for kids to discover.
Yeah, it's been really amazing. It makes such a huge difference when your publisher knows how to position them, how to explain them to the different retail outlets. You need to inform people. You can't assume that they're going to know what these are and where you're targeting them. Even getting them out to schools and libraries, the potential for these, I've always felt was vast, and that we could strike out into a lot of different areas that D&D hasn't had a strong footprint in the past. But a lot of that was almost kind of pie in the sky, and then we could do this, and then we could do this. And it wasn't until the books launched, and, they launched the week of San Diego Comic-Con, and I'm at the show, and they had a really nice banner for it there. And the response from the salespeople and all the people at Random House, and even just when I would walk by the booth, I would see that they were moving very well and people were excited about them and talking about them. And I was really hopeful, like, oh man, this seems, strong. And then we did a signing on the Sunday of San Diego, and they had to cap the line because it was too long and I didn't have enough time to sign them all.
That's amazing.
I thought, what is going on? Like, this is wild, And the amount of photos that I was getting from kids, their parents took photos of them clutching the books, or some of my favorite photos have been kids with their heads down reading them, and the parents, like, they wouldn't look up, for the photo because they're too busy reading. And I'm just like, this is amazing. Or them at the table with their parents, and they've got their set of books, and the parents have the player's handbook and the DMG and everything. It feels really special, and it feels like kind of my own journey into role-playing games has come full circle, and I could not be more proud of it. And that, again, everyone's kind of embraced them or understands what they're meant to be and what they're not, because that's really important as well. Like, that you see the potential in it and the ability for people to come into role-playing games cold without any prior knowledge, because we have so much stuff that we assume about role-playing games because we've been doing it for so long. Like, I don't know exactly when you guys started.
1980 something.
Yeah, exactly, right? The early 80s, first edition. And you just build up assumptions that everyone understands this stuff, that it all makes sense, that it's logical. Even though it's so funny because I'll reread some of the older stuff and I laugh at how sometimes it's really poorly organized or really poorly explained, or how the rule systems, because they were so ad hoc, kind of smashed together and added to in heaps, particularly advanced Dungeons and Dragons, first edition stuff. But it all made sense because you just got used to it, because you just did it, with other people who knew and they told you. And we were just trying to make something that kind of took this sky high view of it and said, what is the most important thing? And whenever you're working on a creative project, you want it to carry through, from your original vision. And the introduction to the Warriors and Weapons book is actually almost word for word from the introduction I wrote for the pitch for the series that I sent to Wizards.
Really?
Yeah, like the introduction is almost word for word what I sent them. If you get right down to it, this is what role-playing in Dungeons & Dragons is. This is a fantasy story. You are the main character. Who are you? What do you do? And that's really what it's all about. That is the precepts that you're trying to explain to someone, that they are the most important part of this story. They're going to play a character. They're central to this experience. They get to make decisions, and those decisions affect what happens to them, and it affects the story going forward. And, that their entertainment and their engagement is a big part of this experience. And I think that that's the kind of stuff that we just assume, like, it's so buried deep in our assumptions. But if people haven't done this stuff before, if they've only heard the words Dungeons and Dragons, or they just see, on Stranger Things, the kids sitting around a table rolling dice, they just don't know that that's what it is. They think it's something else, or they just have no clue, or they're intimidated by it because there's an assumption that they have to be an expert right from the get-go.
So I have so many questions. So many.
No worries. Yeah. Dig right in, man. I love talking about this stuff.
First off, a little inside baseball. The books are published by Random House.
Yes.
How did they come about? Is it an official Dungeons & Dragons product? Is it like a license kind of thing? Or how did that all come together?
It's weird, right? Because Random House is a Wizards of the Coast distributor. So it is kind of all in the family. Like, it is ostensibly, it's a D&D book, and that's why it's got the official branding and everything else on it. But 10 Speed is the particular publisher imprint within Random House. First of all, they deal with this age group and they deal with this kind of format. Mm-hmm. Second of all, they have a completely different kind of sales system and chain that deals with libraries and schools and all that kind of stuff. So rather than trying to push it through the Wizards sales channels, and I know that seems pedantic, but it makes a huge difference if you have people who know how to talk to those outlets and explain to them what things are, while still being able to use the branding and the strength of where D&D's at right now, right? So it was kind of a strategic decision that Random House felt that they could position these differently and use a different publisher within their system, because they weren't going to be game books. You know what I mean? Because they were kind of targeting something else.
Yeah, and I mean, that makes sense historically, too. Like, TSR always had trouble kind of branching out into just regular bookstores.
Right.
Let alone, like, libraries and stuff. So, it makes sense to kind of use what machinery they have to get to those places more efficiently.
Yeah, and yet, we're going through the official Wizards of the Coast channels, and because of my deep ties with the team over there through the comic books and through game development stuff, we're constantly bouncing ideas directly off them. Like it's not removed from the process. And although there is editorial at 10 speed, in many ways, part of my job was to kind of educate them as well. Like out of the 3 editors I work with at 10 speed, only one of them was a gamer. And that is both an advantage and a disadvantage. And in many ways, it was actually an advantage because these were made for people who don't know this stuff. So when my editor's looking at it and is asking questions, that helps me to clarify whether or not we're communicating this stuff properly. You know what I mean? That we are getting through to an absolute layman in terms of the terminology or the kinds of storytelling stuff we're trying to introduce.
Kind of going off of that, it's a set of 4, but only 2 came out so far. Why did you lead off with those 2 particular books?
This sort of ties back to your first question I never kind of fully got to about how did these come about?
Oh, yeah.
So the timing couldn't be better, actually, because, the week that we're recording this is the week that Descent into Avernus just came out. And I had gone into the office. I've been doing the official Dungeons & Dragons comic series since 2014 when 5th edition launched. I got to build up good relationships with the Wizards of the Coast team. And in many cases, I'm sending stuff directly to them. My editors at IDW are always looped in on it, but they're not as gamer heavy and they're more focused on publishing deadlines and art deadlines. They're confident that I know the brand and I know the stuff. And so I just interface directly with Wizards most of the time when it comes to that approval. Mm-hmm. That built up a good relationship. And then Adam Lee, who is one of the heads of story over there, invited me in late 2017 to come into the office for 4 days and brainstorm on an upcoming, by upcoming, I mean 2 years later, product that would eventually become Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. Oh. And so I did 4 days in the office and I did story development on that book. So we worked out some of the big broad beats of what was going to happen, some of the cool gameplay elements, some of the weird and wonderful stuff that got incorporated into the book. And it was just an absolute joy to be there in the office and to work with them in person and to sit at the table and jam on the whiteboards and in the evening just hang out and talk about gaming, talk about creativity and storytelling. And I think the second night I was there, we all went for dinner and I ended up telling the story about how I got into D&D and being 8 years old and my older brother who was 12. We weren't super close, but through Dungeons & Dragons, we kind of found a shared purpose that 4 years doesn't seem like a big deal now that we're older, but when you're 8, that's half your life, And so we had trouble and a 12-year-old doesn't want to spend time with an 8-year-old. And through D&D, we found shared purpose and a lot of amazing memories. And it became just something that we bonded over. And it changed my life. It made me want to be a creative person. It made me want to tell stories for a living. I tell them over and over again, I would not be a writer today without Dungeons and Dragons. And so I tell them the story. It's very heartwarming. Everyone's all cheering. We have a nice, drinks and laughing. And 8 months later, Adam gets in touch with me and says, hey, we were having this meeting with our reps over at Random House, and they're talking about a product for 8 to 12-year-olds to introduce them to concepts of Dungeons and Dragons. I told them they have to get in touch with you because you got to tell them the same story you told me.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Because you tap into that. You remember exactly why it meant something to you. And I think there's something there. Like you should consult for them the way you consulted for us. So that was the original concept, that I was going to just get on the phone, talk for a couple hours, and they would pay me a little bit of money and they would write a bunch of bullet points and then they would find a writer to do this thing. And by the time we got done that first phone call, I was pretty much like a bull in a china shop. I was like, I think I know what this thing should be. Let me put together a proposal. And they were like, well, we didn't even expect you would have time. And I'm like, I kind of don't, but I have to do this. like 8-year-old me needs this. I gotta do this. So I put together a concept for a book that would ostensibly be called The Young Adventurer's Guide to Dungeons and Dragons. And almost as soon as that proposal, I finished writing it and we talked format, they were like, oh, we were thinking these smaller, this 100-page book. And they showed me some samples of what it looked like. And so I sat down and I thumbnailed out how you'd fill 100 pages with thoughts of D&D. And I instantly blew the page count. And I was like, well, that won't work. I said, what if we did 2 books? I said, we'll do a hero book and a monster book. And they were like, I mean, sure, that sounds cool. And then I put together the proposal. And almost as soon as I finished planning out it, I realized it wouldn't fit. And I was like, damn it, it doesn't, there's too much good stuff. Like, I know how to break this into bite-sized pieces. I know what this thing looks like and feels like, but I keep running into these barriers. And so then we said, well, what if we did a magic book? And then the magic book started to form. And then the more we started talking about the monster book, and I said, format-wise, I would love to not be alphabetical, that I think that thematically we could play into locations instead of the alphabet, because this isn't the monster manual.
Yeah, because as I read it, it felt like I was reading Volo's Guide to Monsters.
Right. It was always meant to be about storytelling, and storytelling is about, for a lot of kids, is about location. Where do I find these things? You know, when I was a kid, I would pore over the monster manual and I would make my own little lists. I had a sheet of foolscap paper and I would write down which creatures you could find in which places and which ones were stronger and which ones had the most hit points. Like, I was creating my own little codification and understanding of these creatures in these ways. And so it was all the same kinds of stuff, but just coming at it sort of a different angle. And then as I was talking about locations, I was talking about threading these stories that in the hero book, we would talk about, you know, vampire hunters. And then in the monster book, we would show vampires and then the legendary vampire Strahd. And then in the magic book, we would have the Sun Sword. And I said, we're not telling you those 3 are one story, but it's very easy for you to go 1, 2, 3 and fit it all together narratively if you want to. And they loved that idea. And they said, well, then why wouldn't you talk about Ravenloft? And I was like, well, we don't have a dungeon book. And they said, what if we did have a dungeon book? And I was like, I mean, we could do 4. And so the final version of the proposal became 4 books: a hero book, a magic book, a monster book, and a dungeon book. And that's the grand plan. And then I got a head full of steam and we just started working away. And I got really bold with it. And I said, look, the smartest thing you can do, I know what you want to do, and I know the easiest way to do this book is to grab all the artwork from the monster manual and grab all the artwork from existing products and chunk them down and drop them into this book, because that's how you're going to get this thing out to market fast. But your best chance of getting current D&D fans to check it out is to give them something new. And if the knowledge isn't new, then the art needs to be. As much new artwork as possible. And I sort of, in my proposal, I said, if we could have half new art, that would be great. And of course, the cover. And that was the version we were sort of working with on our original schedule. And then internally, as the book was in development and as things were starting to come together, and you've got to keep in mind, you know, Random House is one of the biggest publishers in the world. So they're getting pieces of this thing pulled together and they're designing up a storm. And internally, they're looking at how this is going to do versus projections and versus the growth of Dungeons and Dragons. And everything looks incredibly strong. And all of a sudden it comes back and says, well, what if we do all new artwork? And I said, well, that would be even better. That suddenly changed all of our timelines. And it also put an incredible amount of pressure on the art studio that we were using to create the art. Because we literally went from, hey, you're doing this many pieces to, oh, can you double that in the same timeline? And so in order not to kill Conceptopolis, and in order for me to continue to be a comic book writer, we had to sort of space out the releases and figure out a different release schedule than the original plan. In my dream, it would have been that we would have had all 4 books out before Christmas, but it just wasn't in the cards.
I like the fact that this is like the sweetest, most heartwarming upsell story I've ever heard. Like, you're just like you went in there and you were just like, I'm going to get him to do 4 books and it's going to be awesome.
I'm a salesman by trade, and the amount of emotional selling that you've done in this situation, Billy Mays would be proud.
You know, that was so fun is that like Adam was on a bunch of these calls and I feel like we just overwhelmed them. Like we were just a barrage of excitement. And he would be riffing on with me like, oh, and it'll be like this. And then, yeah, and there'll be a section like that. And what if you did this? And I'm just scribbling it all down on a piece of paper while we're on the phone. And the Random House people are like, I mean, sure. I mean, that could work. Like they've given us the keys and we're just running into every single room, you know, unlocking everything, going crazy. And then they were like, well, you know, Wizards said, we don't have internal resources because we've got our own product, you know, releases. to art direct it. So who's going to write these art descriptions? And I was like, I will. And they were like, okay, but the editor at 10 Speed's like, well, I don't know the D&D brand well enough to give editorial feedback before these go to Wizards for final approval. I'm like, I can do that. Like it was just like, jumping on as much of it as I could. And very quickly I realized that I was going to need help. And so that's when I brought in Stacey King and Andrew Wheeler, who are dear, close, people in my life who are in my gaming group and are both experienced writers, and basically said, hey, I've got a well, actually, the funny thing was I wasn't originally going to bring them in. I asked Wizards, I said, what freelancers would you recommend for this? And they're like, honestly, you've got this very clearly in mind. You gather the resources. And so then I said, okay, I know who I trust. These are people that I game with. These are people who know where my priorities are and how passionate I am about this stuff. And they're writers, and they're capable, and they're awesome. And Stacey has edited more of my comic stuff than anyone else and deals with all my garbage. And that is a beautiful, terrifying thing to do. And so they both dove in with both feet. And the great thing is that I've got the most Dungeons and Dragons experience, and then Stacey, and then Andrew. So they also kind of brought different, points of view on when they entered the hobby and how they discovered the game. And we would break up the books into sections based on what we were most passionate about. So Stacey loves writing about all the undead stuff. So I was like, great, you write that whole section. And I'm always looking over all the text and editing it. I wrote a bunch of the kind of core sections that I felt the most passionate about, and also the stuff that kind of architected how it all fits and what the format is and the kind of language that we're using. And then Andrew and Stacey used that as their template. And then I came back in and gave it a polish. They would write art notes on their section, and then I would come in and we'd sort of talk thematically about how to break it up or what we could do to make sure that we weren't repeating too many kind of visual motifs over and over again. Just a real team effort all the way around.
The thing about the books that struck me as kind of the most impressive thing, and the thing that kind of has not been previously addressed, is how the books kind of teach you to get into the mindset of role playing, right? Like you always have that one page in the beginning of a rule book where it's like, this is a role playing game. You roll dice, you tell a story, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But nothing like kind of primes you for like the intellectual practice of pretend in this system, right? But
right.
Your books do. You guys really kind of nailed that. I'm curious if you could talk about how you approached that and kind of got that across.
Honestly, one of the things I've thoroughly enjoyed over the years, and I've always been passionate about, is bringing new people into D&D or role-playing games in general. And I got really good at, when I would meet groups of people, as you imagine, I talk pretty passionately about this stuff. And I would get them kind of wound up with the possibilities. Like, this is what it's all about. Don't worry about statistics. Don't worry about all these other things. We're all going to do this together. You're going to have a blast. This is going to be so much fun. And we're going to build a bunch of great memories together. And it's unlike anything else. It got to the point where I would talk about this stuff even in high school. I would get really, really crazy passionate about it. My group of friends who were my regular gamers would joke about it. They would genuinely joke about it. And they would be like, Jim, are you going to do an infomercial about role-playing games and how it's going to improve people's lives, and order now and you'll get a free set of steak knives or whatever? So they, we would sit around joking about it, and they would go, okay, Jim's going to do his infomercial, when someone would be talking about, or we'd have a new friend over and I'd say, hey, we're going to game this weekend. You should totally game this. And they go, oh, here goes Jim. Be careful. There's going to be like a parade of children that are going to come in, and he's going to start pulling out streamers and tell you how it's going to unify the world.
So what you're saying is you've been working on the pitch for Young Adventurers Guide since high school.
When I said I got kind of crazy about Bull in a China Shop, it was like reconnecting to all this stuff I was crazy about. My friends had a nickname for it. They would literally call it Streamers and Kids. They were like, oh, Jim's doing Streamers and Kids again. Here we go. And I had the best feeling because I had actually told Chris Perkins that story at the Wizard of the Coast office. I told him about Streamers and Kids. And I said, and the weirdest thing is now I write the Dungeons and Dragons comic and I'm working on Dungeons and Dragons games. And he just looks at me totally calm and he goes, Jim, Streamers and Kids win. And And I was like, oh my God, streamers and kids win. We won. He's like, yeah, man, you were always right. We were always here waiting for you. And I'm just like, oh, my heart. Like, I can't deal with this. Chris Perkins just told me I was always right. And I know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to role-playing games. That's pretty empowering stuff. It feels like it's all kind of come full circle. So this concept of how to break this thing down to the most basic bite-sized level and then redistribute that information to someone in a way that hopefully doesn't intimidate them, but also prepares them for the journey ahead is something I've literally been doing for 20 years. And so to me, it was like getting it out of my head. It was like getting it onto paper in a way that I'd never done before. And then just making sure we hit our page count.
Are you like 10 pounds lighter now?
Oh my God. Warriors and Weapons was so overwritten. No word of a lie. Stacy did first edit pass on it. And once we got what they call the rough pour, where they take the text and they drop it into their templates with what they feel like might be the proper font size, and they leave approximate areas for art based on our notes. And we were literally like, I think the measurement came back, we had 210% text overage. We had double the amount of text that we needed. And I was like, oh no. But we went through with a hatchet and it got better. The more we were careful and surgically slicing at it, the more focused it got. We got out of our own heads and we got out of our own assumptions and we just got it right down. We trimmed all the fat off and we said, this is what it's all about. This is the core point we need to make. And so as much as I was terrified of all that text being cut, every draft we would cut things down and I was like, no, that's like laser focused. That's exactly where it needs to be.
All right, so speaking of needing more room, you ended up making 4 books. Let's talk about the next book in the series that's about to come out, Dungeons and Tombs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beauty. And it is pretty special in the sense that, location I feel like is so crucial to the kind of storytelling that role-playing games do well. And one of the things that we wanted to set up with Monsters and Creatures was the idea that thematically certain groups of creatures hang together and you can find them in particular kinds of places. And so Dungeons and Tombs is simultaneously like a hitting the high points tour of some of the most famous locations in Dungeons and Dragons lore. And then the back chunk of it is making your own dungeons. And my favorite thing about the original D&D books, which was that section with all the symbols for the maps and grid paper. So it's like making endless hallways and caverns and filling it with traps and cool stuff.
Jim, did we just become best friends? Do you want to go do karate in the garage?
Oh my gosh. I think all of us had, binders full of pre-made characters that we would never play.
Oh yeah.
But, the endless dungeons, the labyrinths of, of everything under the sun, that stuff. I loved poring over those maps more than anything. My brother would run us through an adventure, and afterwards I would read the module and figure out what he had, what we had done properly and what we had screwed up or changed, and endlessly memorize all the different things that were going on and how they all interfaced with each other. And that was the stuff that I loved. And so I wanted to bring that kind of concept to kids where I say, look, you grab this graph paper and you figure out the scale of your map, and then you start filling in these cool things. Here's a bunch of ideas and symbols. You can do this. This isn't some big intimidating thing. It's not difficult to do, and it's a ton of fun.
And I mean, I spent all of 4th grade making maps right out of the basic, so like
Right?
I lost my entire 4th grade education to D&D.
So that's why you're terrible at math.
One of the most enjoyable things that's happened in the last couple of years was my mother is not on social media, but she will listen to interviews like this one. She'll put on podcasts, she'll click play and listen to it. And earlier this year, I did a TED Talk all about my creative career and how Dungeons and Dragons changed my life. And my mom, phoned me afterwards. I didn't tell her what I was doing for the speech or anything. She phones me and she says, I think I finally understand you like that game.
Aw.
And I'm like, it's only been, 30 years or whatever. It's fine. It's good.
I'm pretty sure my mom's still scratching her head too.
I mean, I joked with her. I said, so are you going to play? She's like, oh, no, of course not. But I understand why you like it. I'm like, okay, good. That's progress in any case. It only took this long. But so Dungeons and Tombs, to get back to the core of it, is 6 famous dungeons and then a dungeon bestiary. So we have a handful of creatures done in the template style like we did in Monsters and Creatures, but of specific creatures. They're not from a forest. They're not from a cavern. They're not from the ocean or the sky. They're dungeon specific. You would only find them in places that are being built, as a fortress or as a trap-filled kind of labyrinth. And then a section on building your own dungeon and map making.
Well, on your website, I was tickled when I saw the preview and I saw that there was a gelatinous cube being included in these books.
Yeah, we've got some great creatures in there. Some of the creatures are specific to the dungeons that we mentioned, and a few of them, like the Mimic and the Gelatinous Cube, they're just absolute classics of dungeoneering, but they're very specific to the kind of delving and exploring that you do in D&D. And that's what was really important to me when we were putting together our wish list for which creatures were going to be in Monsters and Creatures. I'm like, you got to have the Beholder, you got to have the Mind Flayer, you got to have ones that are not just generic fantasy like your Pegasus and your Unicorn or your Dragons, but stuff that is iconically D&D. Because D&D is not generic fantasy. It has its own feel. It has its own kind of flavor to it. And I want to make sure that as much as we're teaching them about role-playing as a broad thing, that we're also doing it, with the kind of iconography that, grabbed me so much as a kid.
And that stuff's super important because I don't think that people outside the hobby understand how freaking weird those first generation Dungeons Dragons monsters
They're
are. Like,
wild, man. They're amazing. I love it.
I remember seeing the Beholder as a kid and just being like, what is that? And then later seeing Big Trouble in Little China and seeing that thing that sort of looks like a Beholder and thinking, wait, no, these can't be connected. Like, they're too strange, but they're not really.
I love it. I love that stuff. So the 6 dungeons that we tour through, we wanted to hit real kind of the updated versions of a lot of classics. So I love the Against the Giants module. So we took one of the locations from Storm King's Thunder, which is Iron Slag.
Yes.
So that's a giant's fortress. So it's filled with, cool forges and all sorts of funky stuff, within that burrows deeper and deeper into the mountainside. We've got the Temple of Elemental Evil.
Oh, come on.
So that's basically a shrine of darkness as we describe it. Then we did a weird one because I wanted to do something that was, and this is the funny part. When I brainstormed this thing, I said, I know it's really obscure, but the only kind of iconic ship that I could think of off the top of my head is I said, the Sea Ghost is a pirate ship. And I think a pirate ship for kids is a really cool version of a dungeon. And Adam Lee starts laughing and he goes, Jim, we're updating Saltmarsh. And I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, dude, I don't know how you spiritually connected to us, but we're totally updating Saltmarsh. Yes, you can do the Sea Ghost. And I was like, yeah, because the Saltmarsh trilogy was one of the first modules that I ever played through. And I absolutely loved it. I was obsessed with it. So we did the Sea Ghost as a pirate ship. We do Ravenloft, a vampire's castle. We do Chult, which is the Tomb of Horrors by way of Isle of Dread, essentially.
Nice.
And so we get an exterior, but we also get that kind of, creepy undead aspect and all the traps. And then the last one we do is Under Mountain, the biggest dungeon of them all.
Indeed.
Oh my God, this is so cool. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I am too. I just love, that it's come together so well. So those are the 6 kind of locations. So each location has kind of a broad overview. This is, a beautiful brand new illustration of the location, and we talk about it in a thematic way. Then there is sort of a rundown of key locations within the space. Then we take one area and we essentially spotlight it. And we go, here's an example of an encounter that could take place within this dungeon. Then we have some story prompts. So it's sort of like, these are the kinds of quests you might go on to go to this place. And then we've got a short fiction section, which is the same kind of thing we did in Monsters and Creatures, where you get a cool bit of fiction and a beautiful piece of art. And then you get those little question prompts, which is something that I kind of baked into the architecture of these books, is call and response. In the Warriors and Weapons book, there are those questions about each race and each class where it asks you questions. And if you answer them, you may realize you want to be one over the other. You know what I mean? And that flow chart that we put together as well. And then the encounter fiction is all about giving people an example of kind of play in a way that they recognize, kind of prose, and then a series of questions that leave it open-ended. What would you do? What kind of decision would you make?
Yeah, and all that stuff I feel like was a super effective, super condensed sort of pick your path kind of thing. That gets back to my point about the priming you for RPG thinking without actually having to deal with any of the kind of systems or the heavier stuff that pushes people away. I think that's so good.
Right. And that's what, if you're sitting down with a brand new player or with a kid, that's what they need. They need questions and answers. They need empowerment to understand that they're important and they get to decide things. The rest of it doesn't matter. I'll tell you when to roll the dice. I'll give you the dice to roll and I'll tell you the target number. That kind of granular, crunchy stuff, the dungeon master is going to deal with. Your fellow players are going to help you with. What you need is motivation on a narrative level and on a creative level. And that's the way the books have been kind of distilled down, is showing you and giving you multiple examples of those kinds of systems. The systems of it's your turn, the system of you're a part of this group, the system of what stuff do you have and what cool things can you contribute to the story.
Yeah, the packs. That was another thing in the Warriors and Weapons is the equipment pack. That's just such a great way to kind of get across like what you're doing in a D&D game through the stuff that you're carrying.
Yeah, one of the things I used to do, because the original D&D books would have some illustrations of weapons, but not other ones, I would go to the library and I would look up the weapons that weren't in the books because I wanted to be able to vision them. I wanted to be able to see them in my mind. And so I was like, as much artwork as possible. We want to show the different types of armor. We want to show the different pieces of equipment. We want to be able to lay this stuff out like someone planning their pack before they put it into the backpack. That is a very visceral thing for a kid to imagine. I don't just have an item. I have this sword. I don't just carry stuff. I'm carrying this stuff. And each thing has a purpose. You know what I mean? That you can ask a kid. And also systems that were not just about, because there's no statistics on anything, it's all about what weapon do you think looks cool or feels appropriate for your character? Or what piece of equipment helps tell your story? Things like trinkets. We want to encourage kids to think about non-combat related items, a lucky coin or, some little trinket or key or things that can add options to the way that they tell their story. One of my favorite sidebars in the Warriors and Weapons book is we talk about giving your character a weakness. That we talk about, it's not just about kicking butt, that it's essentially about, is your character have a flaw that they're trying to overcome? Because that's where good storytelling comes from.
So speaking of cool, one of the things that I loved about the Young Adventurers guides, when you're talking about kids being like, I just want to use this weapon because it looks cool, Minx popped up in one of the pages of the guide, as well as Boo, which if you're talking about a kid popping and being like, oh my God, I want to be like that guy because that guy looks cool, I don't think there's any character more cool looking than Minx and Boo.
So many people love those characters, and he's such a memorable and fun character. And attitude-wise, he's the kind of character that makes stories happen. He kicks down the door. He heroically ventures forth courageously despite, the odds. That's the kind of stuff that encourages people into action. You know what I mean? Rather than being too timid about what they should do at the table.
And he's kind of a big kid.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's got a pet hamster, for crying out loud. What kid isn't going to find that amusing, And that's the thing. Some of the characters are more serious and some of them are more silly. And D&D can encompass all those things. Now, on a completely selfish level, I'm writing Minsk and Boo in the D&D comic series. And so I want that character to have a bunch of visibility. The legendary rogue is Shandy, who's a character I made for the comic series, but she's also a really cool character that doesn't act like what you might think of as a typical rogue. And she's got a really distinct personality and has a lot of opportunity for good storytelling as well. So it was like, okay, we're going to have Brunner Battlehammer and we're going to have, Wolfgar, because they're famous characters from novels that a lot of people recognize, but we can sort of bounce around to different parts of D&D, or we can create all new legendary characters that show combinations that maybe haven't been put into the spotlight before.
I feel like it was kind of a relief not having Drizzt in there, and having Minsk in there instead. Like it just kind of shifts the tone in a way that felt more welcoming.
We talked about it, obviously, and Drizzt Do'Urden was a natural choice in some respects, but then I looked and I said, okay, we've got two characters from the Bob Salvatore books. And I feel like I don't just want to hit that same thing over and over again. Minsk is, when you're playing to a younger audience, I think he's got the right kind of attitude for bombastic play rather than kind of the tortured soul that is Drizzt, right?
Oh,
Not to
absolutely.
say I don't love those books, not to say I don't, wasn't a huge fan, and I am. And Bob's a friend, and everything is so cool about that stuff. But when we were looking at the target audience and we were looking at the kind of things we're trying to bring out of these players, Minsk felt like the bombastic, joyous kind of character that would work best in the book.
When you do the Teenager's Adventurer's Guide and you introduce Planescape, you could bring Drizzt in there.
That's
I feel
right.
like he'll be the moody kind of anti-hero, or not anti-hero, but angsty.
Planescape is my favorite D&D setting. So I am also the target audience for that.
It's my turn to say that now you're my best friend. I feel so seen.
I love Planescape. Planescape and Ravenloft were my jam, but Planescape is like the greatest thing ever because it's the kitchen sink of settings, because it's like connects everything together. And then it also had all the different factions.
Yeah.
So then you would add your like loyalty kind of element to it that was a little bit almost White Wolfy, where you have the different, within your party, you have schisms of loyalties and stuff like that. I absolutely loved it. The fact that, Tony DiTerlizzi designed the heck out of it and made it all unbelievably beautiful, and this elegant, kooky design sense just burned it into my brain. I absolutely love it.
Well, it's funny because in a previous episode, we actually interviewed Tony DiTerlizzi.
Oh.
And he was talking about the Spiderwick Chronicles. And he was like, man, I always thought it would be cool to do kind of like a field guidebook for the kids that wasn't so D&D heavy. And we were like, my God, this is the greatest idea we've ever heard. And then like literally months later, here are the Young Adventurers guides.
Yeah, we're all on the same wavelength there. And when we were putting the book together, I got really passionate about certain things in the Monsters and Creatures book. First of all, the not alphabetical, we were going to go thematic. We were going to start underground, and then we'd build to the surface, and then we'd end in the sky, which meant that we could end with dragons, which I felt like dramatically was the right thing to do. But not only that, but that I wanted to describe the size of creatures using modern comparisons. So, for example, we explain, that a beholder is the size of a giant beach ball, so that a kid can instantly, viscerally understand what that looks like in front of them. That if I tell them that if they look out the second story window, they would be looking Demogorgon in the face, they understand how tall that is. Do you know what I mean? In a way that just telling them raw footage is not.
This is so perfect because every dinosaur book that my kid has tells me and him that a Diplodocus is the length of 3 buses, right?
Bingo.
I'm totally with you on this.
Yeah, that was so important to me, that we would use terminology that we would never talk down to our readers, but we would make it as easy as possible to activate their imagination, that we would give them things that they can instantly compare it to and understand. And that was so important to me as a storytelling tool. And it was a shortcut for us to save us a lot of time and hassle. The hardest thing was actually continually coming up with different comparisons that felt fun and a little bit unexpected.
So with this, we know there's 2 more volumes coming out. Obviously, we talked about the Dungeons and Tombs, and we know we've also got Wizards and Spells coming out next year in March. Are there any plans for more books after Wizards and Spells?
Legally, I cannot confirm or deny.
Hey, man, I had to shoot my shot.
The intense success of the Young Adventurers guides and the intense amount of enthusiasm from Wizards of the Coast and 10-Speed Press. But it's entirely possible there are more in development.
Well, dude, congratulations. I can't tell you enough how much the work that you've done on just the Young Adventurers guides means to people like me and Stu, and to others that I know when they present it to their children, and getting the kids into the game, and for older gamers to kind of have that thing that makes them pop. You remember why you fall in love with it all over again. And if anyone had that moment where they were trying to remember what got that spark going in the first place, these are the books for it. The Young Adventurers guides are currently in every good bookstore out there. The Dungeons and Tombs is available on November 26th. Wizards and Spells is available on March 10th. You can pre-order them now on Amazon. You can pre-order them now at Barnes & Nobles. You could probably walk into your friendly bookstore, high-five the owner and say, hey, these are ones I want. Get them for me, please.
Thank you so much. Like I was saying at the start of this thing, you put a lot of time and effort into a creative project, and you're not always sure what the response is going to be like. And this has just been an absolute trip. It's been a blast.
This was a really great conversation. I feel like we're all best friends now. We're warm and fuzzy and slightly nihilistic. Just a great hour of conversation.
Well, when we're gearing up for Wizards and Spells, let's do it again.
All right.
Absolutely. So, Jim, for our listeners, where can the people find you online?
It's nice and simple. Just jimzub.com. So JIMZUB.com. And I've got, previews and interviews on there for my upcoming comic projects and game projects. There's a rundown of what conventions I'll be at and ordering links for all my books. There's also tutorials on how to write comics, how to pitch your stuff to a publisher.
Jim, thank you again so much.
My absolute pleasure.
Thanks to Jim Zub for calling in and doing an interview with Stu and I. And also, we have a part 2 of this interview coming out, and it's going to drop on November 19th, the same day that Dungeons & Dragons Rick and Morty hits your friendly local gaming store shelves. And surprise, surprise, Jim wrote that too. And let me tell you, the stories that he tells about writing Dungeons & Dragons Rick and Morty is some can't miss stuff. So definitely check back in next week for a rowdy Rick and Morty interview with Jim Zub. For Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.